Elias lived on the periphery of the Whisperwood Estates, a residential development characterized by its obsession with uniformity and its governing body, the Homeowners Association, or rather, the relentless, omnipresent tyranny of its board president, Janet. Unlike the other residents whose homes sat on quarter-acre lots manicured with approved cultivars, Elias owned a 5-acre parcel of land that predated the development by 2 generations. His house was modest, but his land was productive. Every summer, a vast, thriving expanse of corn grew on his property, a deep green, rustling forest that provided both a healthy harvest and a wonderfully natural barrier against the endless parade of regulatory memos. To Elias, the corn was heritage; to Janet, it was an offense. Janet, a woman whose life seemed entirely dedicated to the meticulous enforcement of aesthetic monotony, despised the corn. She deemed it unapproved agriculture, a blight upon the visual plane, and, most damningly in her written communiques, a fire hazard. Elias had countered every single notice with legal precedent. His land was grandfathered in. The agricultural activity was protected. The corn, fully mature and nearly ready for harvest, was not a fire hazard, it was a crop, and it was planted hundreds of feet from the nearest Whisperwood home. But Janet didn't deal in facts or law, she dealt in the intoxicating, self-granted power of the HOA seal. She had tried every avenue to force him to chop it down: excessive fines, threats of lien, and even attempts to have the local zoning board reclassify his land. All had failed, leaving her furious and increasingly desperate. The final, heated confrontation occurred during a compliance walkthrough, an event Janet treated with the gravity of a royal inspection. She stood at the edge of his property line, dressed in blindingly white linen, her nose practically twitching with distaste as she gazed upon the 10-foot-tall stalks swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. "Mr. Vance," she stated, her voice tight with controlled fury, "this harvest is unacceptable. It diminishes every property value in the immediate vicinity. I am giving you 24 hours to cut this down, or we will commission a landscaping service to remove this blight and charge the full amount, plus fees, to your account." Elias simply leaned against the post of his fence, looking at the immense green wall. "Janet, you are standing on private property. You have no legal right to touch my corn. If you send anyone onto my land, I will have them arrested for criminal trespass and theft of agriculture. Now please, leave my property." He spoke calmly, but his tone carried the immutable weight of the law, which only seemed to enrage her further. She stalked away, radiating palpable menace, her retreat more of a strategic withdrawal than a defeat. The next day, the air was still and dry, perfect conditions for a harvest but also, ominously, for fire. Elias was inside, finalizing logistics with a local canning operation, when he heard a faint crackling sound, quickly followed by the distinct, acrid smell of smoke. He rushed outside and his heart seized in his chest. At the far corner of his field, near the tree line that abutted the Whisperwood community's common green space, a bright, malevolent orange was flickering against the deep green. A small, but rapidly expanding fire was eating its way into his mature corn. He didn't need a detective to know what had happened. This was not a random accident, it was a malicious, cowardly act. The location was too precise, too targeted, and the recent threats too fresh. Elias grabbed his phone and immediately called 911, his voice tight but steady as he reported the blaze. Then, he turned his attention to the fire itself. Despite its small size, corn, once dried and ready for harvest, is incredibly flammable. The flames were already leaping high, fueled by the dried leaves and stalks, and the dry breeze was pushing the fire sideways, creating a terrifying momentum. He ran to his old barn, grabbed a shovel and several buckets, and began frantically trying to beat back the blaze at its nearest edge, knowing full well his efforts were merely a stopgap. The priority was containment and protection of the barn, but the true devastation was already happening in the field. Within minutes, the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing rapidly louder. As the first fire truck rounded the corner of Whisperwood Estates and sped toward Elias's property, Janet's large house, one of the first homes built near the entrance, provided a clear view of the disaster. She was standing at her window, ostensibly watching the emergency response, but she wasn't watching the fire truck, she was watching the corn burn. Her expression, Elias would later recall, was chilling, a momentary flash of absolute, triumphant satisfaction, quickly masked by a practiced look of civic concern. She thought she had won. She thought the flames would destroy the evidence and the crop, solving her aesthetic problem permanently. What she hadn't considered was that in calling emergency services, Elias had introduced a far more professional, legally mandated entity into the equation, an entity trained to find the source of every ignition. As the fire engine's powerful hoses began to drench the roaring blaze, a secondary, unmarked truck from the fire marshal's office quietly followed, parking discreetly across the street, its occupants already eyeing the perimeter for signs of forced entry or, more damningly, intentional ignition. The cost of a few bushels of corn had just escalated into a federal offense. The fire department's immediate response was a spectacle of professional efficiency, a furious ballet of water and steam that quickly overwhelmed the small but vicious cornfield fire. Within 15 minutes, the main body of the blaze was contained, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened scar at the corner of Elias's property. The true drama, however, was just beginning, and it was unfolding not in the ruined field, but on the quiet, manicured streets of Whisperwood Estates. Elias had called the fire department for aid, but what arrived was the long, heavy arm of the state's investigative and legal structure. While the uniformed firefighters were busy soaking the remains of the corn and dampening the surrounding perimeter to prevent flare, UPS, a separate, unmarked sedan, carrying two men in plain clothes, quietly pulled up near Janet's house. These were investigators from the fire marshal's office, and they operated on an entirely different set of protocols than the local HOA. To the fire marshal, this was not a dispute over visual continuity, it was a suspicious agricultural fire in a highly populated area, and the first order of business was to determine origin and cause. The presence of the residential neighborhood made the investigation mandatory and immediate, given the high risk to human life and property. The lead investigator, a meticulous, stocky man named Detective Miles, first conferred with Elias, taking detailed notes on the history of the conflict, the numerous threats Janet had made regarding the fire hazard, and the timing of the blaze relative to the last confrontation. He then walked the scene, moving from the areas of least damage toward the point of origin. Unlike a natural fire caused by lightning or machinery, a field fire ignited by human hands leaves a distinct signature. Miles and his partner quickly confirmed a key detail: the fire did not start randomly in the field. It originated precisely at the edge of the common area tree line, a spot where Janet could have easily accessed the field without stepping too far onto Elias's property. Furthermore, the burn pattern showed clear signs of an incendiary device or accelerant being used to defeat the natural resistance of the green corn stalks, indicating intentional ignition rather than a casual spark. They collected soil and ash samples, carefully tagging and packaging them for laboratory analysis, evidence that would be unassailable in court. Meanwhile, Janet was a wreck. She had been observing the fire from her pristine living room window, initially with smug satisfaction. She thought a small fire would destroy the evidence of her trespass and demolish the offending crop, leaving her free to levy the cleanup cost against Elias. But the arrival of the second, police-like car and the slow, methodical way the plainclothes officers were combing the scene, bagging samples, and stringing up bright yellow crime scene tape, filled her with cold dread. She understood the unspoken implication: this was no longer a civil matter. This was arson. The moment of reckoning came swiftly. Having secured the evidence and established the probable point of intentional ignition, Detective Miles and a uniformed police officer walked straight to Janet's front door. They knocked sharply, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Janet opened the door a crack, her composure utterly shattered, replaced by raw, frantic panic. She was still wearing the white linen, but it was now crumpled and her hair was disheveled, the picture of a woman whose carefully constructed world of control was violently crumbling. Detective Miles did not mince words. He identified himself and stated clearly, "Mrs. Vance, we are investigating the Cornfield fire on Mr. Vance's property as a suspected arson. We need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts and activities this afternoon, particularly regarding any threats you made toward the property or the crop." Janet immediately went into full denial, her voice pitching high and thin. "Arson? That's ridiculous. It was a hazard, I told them it was a hazard. I was inside my home the entire afternoon. I know nothing about a fire." The officers remained calm and professional, their lack of emotion only magnifying her escalating hysteria. They simply asked her to provide a sworn statement of her alibi and requested permission to check her yard for any discarded items that might relate to the ignition. Suddenly, Janet realized the trap she had walked into. She had been so focused on eliminating the corn that she hadn't considered the forensic investigation. She recalled the distinct smell of the fluid she had used to ensure the green stalks would catch, and the plastic container she had quickly tossed into her own trash bin. Panic surged. She slammed the door shut, locking it and retreating into her house, convinced that if she didn't talk, the problem would simply go away. But the fire department was not the HOA. They didn't retreat over a slammed door. The police officers simply stepped aside, the weight of the law now bearing down on the petty tyrant. The investigators knew they had their prime suspect. The next step was securing a warrant based on the physical evidence found at the scene and the witness testimony provided by Elias. Janet had wanted Elias to experience the heat of her power, but she was now staring into the rapidly expanding inferno of a criminal investigation. Janet's immediate panic and subsequent refusal to cooperate proved to be the final, fatal misstep in her calculated act of destruction. Slamming the door on the fire marshal's investigators did not buy her time, it simply solidified their suspicion, providing the grounds for a warrant. The forensic evidence collected from the scorched cornfield, the distinctive chemical residue indicating an accelerant, combined with Elias's detailed history of her threats, was sufficient. Within hours, detectives returned to Whisperwood Estates, not with a simple request, but with a police escort and a signed judicial search warrant authorizing a thorough search of Janet's property for evidence relating to the arson. The arrival of uniformed police cars, lights flashing discreetly, at the home of the HOA president was an event that instantly shredded the delicate veil of suburban normalcy. Neighbors peered from behind blinds, witnessing the astonishing, public dismantling of Janet's authority. The detectives, efficient and methodical, executed the warrant. They bypassed the expensive furnishings and focused on the utilitarian spaces. In the large, meticulously organized garage, they found a gardening shed. There, amidst bottles of approved pesticides and weed killers, they located a partially used container of charcoal lighter fluid that matched the accelerant signature later identified in the lab. More damningly, an officer sifting through the household trash bin found a pair of expensive leather gardening gloves with small, Charred edges and faint traces of soot. The evidence was irrefutable. The incendiary inspector had become the prime suspect in a criminal investigation. The arrest was conducted quietly but firmly. Janet, pulled from her spotless kitchen, was stunned and weeping, trading her customary crisp attire for the cold reality of handcuffs. The spectacle of the HOA president being escorted into the back of a police cruiser for arson sent shockwaves through the community, immediately eclipsing years of minor regulatory grievances. This was not a dispute over mailbox color or lawn height. This was a serious felony, a direct attack on a neighbor that threatened the lives and property of the entire community. The /350 fine levied for the fire department's immediate response was the least of her worries. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Janet was charged with second-degree arson, a felony that carried significant jail time. Her initial bail hearing was fraught, and the judge, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the clear danger to the surrounding homes, set bail prohibitively high. The HOA, reeling from the scandal, convened an emergency, mandatory board meeting. Faced with the complete erosion of public trust and the terrifying legal liability Janet had exposed them to, the board voted unanimously, and with immense relief, to immediately and permanently strip Janet of all her titles, powers, and membership status within the HOA. She was now simply an isolated defendant, severed from the organization she had ruled with an iron fist. The civil repercussions followed close behind the criminal charges. Elias, whose corn harvest was partially destroyed but whose resolve was absolute, did not pursue a simple property damage claim. He sued Janet personally for the full value of the lost crop, the cleanup and restoration costs, and, crucially, for emotional distress and punitive damages stemming from malicious, intentional destruction of private property. Elias's attorney masterfully used Janet's years of harassing memos and her outright verbal threats as evidence of a pattern of reckless behavior that culminated in the criminal act. The punitive damages sought were enormous, designed to reflect the severity of the arson and the financial damage caused by her tyranny. As the criminal trial approached, Janet's expensive legal defense collapsed under the weight of the forensic evidence and witness testimony. Faced with the near certainty of a guilty verdict and a lengthy prison sentence, she was advised to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a lesser, but still serious, felony charge, which included a reduced sentence, but mandated massive restitution. The financial penalty was devastating. She was ordered to pay Elias the full amount of his civil suit, hundreds of thousands of dollars in addition to court costs, hefty fines, and the complete cost of the fire department's intervention. The consequences were finalized in the cold transfer of assets. Janet was forced to sell her meticulously maintained, highly valuable home to satisfy the judgment, and the proceeds barely covered the restitution and legal debts. The woman who had obsessed over the visual continuity of the neighborhood, and who had tried to solve her aesthetic problem with a match, was ultimately forced out of that very neighborhood, leaving behind a ruined reputation and a smoldering legal legacy. Her final, most ironic punishment was watching the successful, bountiful harvest of Elias's next corn crop from the cramped, institutional confines of her temporary holding facility, a bitter end to her reign of fiery, self-imposed terror.